Hi everyone and welcome to One Autistic Person. This is the 41st video in a 50 video series that I'm doing going through the statements of the autism quotient. The autism quotient is a pre-screening tool that is often used as part of the assessment process for autism. And as most people will probably be aware if they've gone through the diagnosis process, that it very much looks at things as a deficit, as does the whole diagnosis process in general. It has to do so for it to be deemed a diagnosis, but what I wanted to do with these videos when I first started them was I wanted to flip that narrative and look at, rather than just looking at it as deficit, looking at it as benefit, but they've kind of morphed into more of it looking at difference rather than deficit, which also does lead to looking at benefits as well, but also looking at how maybe it could be perceived from other people, maybe the neurotypical world, or just people looking in at us in general. So that's kind of where it's got to, because the statements quite kind of start to overlap a little bit and start becoming a little bit repetitive. So it meant that I had to change how I was looking at it, and I quite like looking at it more as a difference. But like I say, that then looks at benefit as well. So this is the 41st question on the autism quotient, which is, I like to collect information about categories of things. Now, I definitely agree to this because I do. I like factual information. I like collecting a lot of information, and I can categorize things in my brain quite a lot, as well as in working life and that type of thing. Everything I like everything to be categorized, and I think it gives a lot of order. But I think this comes from a place of sort of looking at special interests. So what I'm going to do in the video today is look at it from that perspective, and I'm also going to sort of like touch on the fact of somebody who, as I am, has autism and ADHD. That means that they can look quite different, and from a diagnostic process and from sort of a self-awareness process, can be quite difficult for you to sort of navigate before going through the diagnosis process, and it can be quite off-putting because special interests can look a little bit different for people who are ADHD, and it isn't until you sort of look deeper that maybe it can be quite confusing, because it might not look quite as monotropic as you may expect it to, but it still is from my experience of it. So autistic people are often monotropic, which I've touched on quite a lot in other videos that I've done. So monotropism is a theory of autism, which basically means that our brains look at things in a mono perspective. We're very hyper focused on one thing generally, and we struggle to look outside of that, and that sort of is within everything, and that it kind of explains everything in relation to autism. If you haven't looked at anything in relation to monotropism before, I will put a link into the video on in the description, so you can have a look in more depth of the theory of monotropism. The thing I really love about the monotropism in general is the fact that it was developed, the concept has been developed by people who are autistic, which is kind of a new thing, and it's not necessarily always been the case. And quite often looking at theories of autism are actually looking at it from an external perspective and looking in on autism rather than looking at it from an autistic person's perspective. So I think that might be why it kind of sits quite nicely with a lot of autistic people, because it feels like it truly explains what life experience is like for us. So we have a narrower experience of things, and that we enjoy, and we can be hyper focused on these interests, and sometimes fail to meet our own needs or to focus on other things that our mind sees as less important, and that can also mean that we don't take care of our own needs, like going to the toilet, for instance, or remembering to drink, or remembering to eat, or even remembering anything exists outside of that thing that we're doing. And we can be so focused on our special interests that we can struggle to enjoy other things if we're taken out of that special interest, which can be quite hard to deal with and quite traumatic. We can know a lot about this area of interest and may want to talk about it a lot, and are often able to make links in other situations to that special interest. So we can make a lot of links in life in relation to that special interest. We can also make links in our minds to what's going on, but also to the people around us. But also when we communicate with other people, we can quite often end up pulling the conversation back to a special interest, or at least I find that personally, that if that special interest is something something that I've been taking part in, it then is quite often part of a conversation, or it'll be linked back to, and I can say, well, it's like in this situation with this, and this relates to that. And a lot of things in my life end up relating back to a special interest, especially one that I've been very much focused on. It can make it look very different, like I say, in relation to if you have autism, if you're autistic and you have ADHD, it can feel very different, or it can the analysis of it personally can be much more complicated, because you kind of tend to, from my perspective, I have like a few special interests that run through the middle of everything, but there's lots of sort of side quests that come from it. So autism for me is very much my sameness. It's where I like routine. It's where I like everything to be the same, and I don't like things changing. But then ADHD is constantly craving novelty and wanting new things and wanting new experiences. But what I have noticed is that those new experiences quite often relate back to a special interest. Otherwise, I struggle with them outside of that. So it's kind of this messy intertwined thing when you're an ADHD. It's quite complicated, but it's just, I suppose, what I'm trying to do is make people aware who might be going through the process of self-understanding in relation to being autistic, that if you also feel that there's a possibility that you have ADHD as well as being autistic, there is a possibility that your special interests may look a little bit more erratic, and you may be able to come out of those special interests a lot easier, or you might have lots of short-term interests that you have huge focus on that are very different, or appear to be very different to your main special interest, but you might also have some things that you've known for years and years and years. So for me, there's things like The Sims that have been around for me for the last 25 years. Roller coasters been around for probably the same amount of time, longer actually, I would say. My very niche interest in queens in history and women in power historically being mistreated and quite often receiving capital punishment and that type of thing. So that's very niche, but something I'm very, very interested in. And social justice and that type of thing. They're very so I've got this sort of these main things that are really important to me. But for me, yes, it's all intertwined and messy, but they when I've actually analysed it a lot more and really looked at it, a lot of those things come back into it. But then I've got roller coasters, which aren't really part of anything other than the fact that I love the feeling of roller coaster. I love it, and I love the mechanical element of them. I love the science behind them. There's so much that's there, and they sort of link in quite a lot to the fact that I have other interests come from my understanding of roller coasters, like my interest of science and stuff like that, and physics comes from originally from that sort of main focus of that. So I've had lots and lots of interests over time, but I'm so hyper focused on those things, and I can be for sort of like 3 months, and then it just isn't part of my life anymore. But then there's these other things that are so important to me that I keep coming back to. So that's my point I'm trying to make, is that there is a difference for people quite often when it comes to autism and ADHD together. So just to be aware of that, if you're sort of like questioning yourself in relation to it, because it's one of the things that I questioned quite a bit, was like, do I have special interests? Are they really that hyper focused? But then having conversations and really analysing it is like, yes, there are these things that I have that are so important to me, but there's also transient ones as well. So, and also just being clear on the fact you don't have to have a special interest, even if you don't, if you're not ADHD as well as autistic, you can have transient special interests that, they can change. It's not like we have to stay focused on those things for all of our lives. It's just some things can do, and they can last for a really long time. And actually, if you're really hyper focused on one subject for 6 months, a year, then that's a huge amount of focus to be put into something. And I think it comes down to sort of like that nicheness, and going really into detail about things is really what a special interest is. So don't be put off by thinking I can only have one interest and that's it, because that is not true. When it comes to autism, you don't. That's not the case. It's just that you kind of tend to throw yourself in a lot and think just about that thing. That's kind of what makes it a special interest. It's not necessarily longevity. It's the amount of energy you put into that thing. So that's really what's more important, I think, from a perspective of understanding what a special interest is. So what I want to have a look at was sort of as well some of the benefits that come from in relation to special interests. So there are sorts of pleasure, enthusiasm, and focus. So so it's something we can feel passionate about, and we get a lot of pleasure from, and that's a good thing. That is definitely a benefit. But from an ADHD perspective, it can actually make us extremely focused, something that we can sometimes struggle with in relation to executive function. So it can make us it can build and help us understand focus a little bit more. It does allow us to be focused on something, and it can actually ground us and make us feel a little bit less stressed about the fact that we're unable to start other things. And I found spending time on that special interest can eventually let me sort of focus a bit better on other things. So in a world when focus is a problem for you, and when you're getting to those executive functioning issues, having a special interest and being enthusiastic about it and allowing yourself to focus on it can really help you with certain elements of not feeling like you're a failure. Because I feel like that all the time, that I'm failing at being able to have focus, and it can feel like, what's wrong with my head? Why am I not able to do this? But it makes you realize that you can. So to me, it's extremely pleasurable and makes me feel better about myself. It's intrinsically motivating and rewarding. And again, as an ADHDer, dopamine is really important to us. And if we get that reward feeling, that can actually help us feel better in relation to self-esteem and that type of thing. As well as giving, and that's kind of comes to the next one that I've got here, which is provide a sense of pride for us. So it can make us feel proud of the fact that we are achieving things, when sometimes we can struggle so much with the world in general that can actually be something we feel pride in. And it reminds us that we are human, that we are able to do the things that other people are able to do, just differently and in a more monotropic way, or on a more specified interest. But it can really help with those feelings that you sometimes get that make you feel quite down about yourself. It boosts your self-esteem. All of those things will make you feel better. It can allow you to feel like you're achieving something, and that the things that are a struggle in the world, it can make you feel and understand the fact that we have worth, because I think sometimes we kick ourselves all the time for not having not being enough, and the world can make us feel that way. Special interest can really reiterate to us that we shouldn't be feeling that way. And can contribute to overall well-being. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. They're the same as reducing anxiety. I think all of those things are linked quite a lot. It can be a coping strategy in a time of distress, including catering for our sensory needs. So quite often we will actually levitate towards a special interest because of the fact that it will help our sensory needs if we do have sensory differences. Quite a lot of people do feel that they're related to their sensory needs. And that can help with distressing situations. If you feel like you're going into a meltdown situation, you can sometimes catch it in time, or I can personally feel like I can catch it in time and go and take part in one of my special interests, and that will make me feel better. I'll watch a video about roller coasters, or I'll play The Sims, and it will make me feel much more balanced and able to deal with whatever's coming next. I'm not saying it would only be one roller coaster video; it could be 20, but you know what I mean. It helps with that overall feeling of if you're getting too distressed in a situation, if you're getting close to meltdown or burnout, it can help with that. It can give us an area of expertise and knowledge in a world that we may feel very lost in. I know I can feel quite lost in general outside of my safety net. But knowing that I have this knowledge and expertise can help me in the world and sort of not feel as lost, because it gives me something to think about when I internalize in situations that are difficult for me. If we're talking about children, it can help promote learning and cognitive development, because it's allowing children to do things that they might not do if they didn't have that special interest. So it's allowing them to interact with the world that might be much more complicated for that person to take part in. It helps to build skills and knowledge and understanding of the world in general. It can improve focus and attention. Again, if you're an ADHDer, the attention side of things can be difficult at times. It can help with social skills and engagement with others, and productivity at work if links can be found in a working environment. So finding a link to sort of transferable skills. It can be that can be really helpful, but it can also help people to socialize and to have something to talk about, and to feel confident in, and bring them into conversation. And that includes increasing joint attention in situations as well. So being able to have attention at the same time as other people in a group setting, and it can help to build transferable skills, as I've already said, and that can sometimes it can be quite difficult for us to learn transferable skills, because of the fact of learning is different for us, and we can quite often learn differently. So it can sometimes help with those kind of things. So there's a lot of positives that come from special interests, and I think if you can sort of link your special interest to, if you're training in a job and you can find links between that, or if you're doing further education and you can find links to, what I've realised is I've quite often ended up talking about or using my special interest in learning or in training. I've used it as a way to sort of bridge the gap when learning's been complicated for me. So finally, what I wanted to have a look at on this was what does it look like from an external perspective, and I want to separate this into two different areas. Of one, when it's understood, when it's misunderstood, where special interests are misunderstood by the person involved, whether that's for somebody we know or somebody we don't know, or if it's understood, and sort of looking at the differences between those two. So from a misunderstanding perception, it can look like just an obsession with one subject, which I can see why it's possibly the case, but actually it can build much wider conversation if people engage with it, and it can quite often lead into a further conversation rather than it just being stuck on that. It may stick on it longer than the person really wants, and they can see that as being obsession, but actually if they allowed the conversation to flow, it could potentially lead to more, because you'd already feel confident and that you'd feel like you were part of that discussion. Because we can sometimes tend to bring it back to that as well. It can feel like that's the only thing you're talking about, even though quite often I see it as I'm just relating that back to the thing that we were talking about previously. It can be seen as isolation or social or antisocial, which is understandable, especially if your special interest is something that it tends to be something you're just going to experience by yourself generally, unless your special interest is socializing or is something very social or a sport or something like that. But if it's something that it seems like it's isolating from an external perspective, somebody misunderstanding it can just see it as isolation. And could be antisocial. It can be seen as monologuing and can be seen as a conversation takeover, which I've already kind of touched on, and it can sometimes be that. And the more somebody knows you, the more they can tend to sort of build a conversation around a special interest with you. I think it can be extremely frustrating for people. It can be seen as a lack of interest, as the special interest is seen as unimportant, because it might seem like to the observer that it is unimportant, but to you it is important. And it can be seen as selfish. I've had it quite often where people have just seen that because I'm engaging in my special interest, that it's selfish and it's about me. If it's understood, for me, what I've come to realise is that it can be a way to connect. So it's a way to be able to connect with other people. It's a way to connect with the autistic person, and it's a way to actually allow further conversation to happen if you allow the person to explain and be part of that conversation by them sort of linking up their special interests with a wider conversation. It can be really helpful to build connection. Sharing interests and often life experiences through that interest. So like I say, I quite often link my special interests to my life experiences, and it allows me to communicate those life experiences while referring to something that I feel comfortable about. It can definitely be seen from somebody who understands it as anxiety relief and a sense of purpose. So a positive influence on the autistic person's life, and their well-being being better for the fact that they have that special interest. A way of making sense in the world when we often feel quite out of control. I think that's really important when people see that, because now the people in my life see those things as me taking control again, and sort of me being able to feel a place and purpose in the world, and a sense of making sense of what's going on around me. Quite often I will go and play things out in The Sims and I don't even realise I'm doing it, but I now know I'm kind of doing that to be able to process the world around me. A way to build a relationship and engage in give and take conversations, something we struggle with quite often, whereas if the other person shows an interest in it and understands the fact of the need for that, it allows for you to engage in that give and take, which can sometimes be problematic. And finally, I would say the biggest and most important one is happiness and contentment. That's probably what is the most important thing that somebody should be seeing once they understand a special interest, is that the person who is autistic, that they're happy and enjoying their life while they're taking part in that interest, and it's good for their well-being. So that's what I have to say about special interests. Thank you very much for watching the video. As always, if you want to drop a comment in about what your special interests are, what you think about special interests, how you think that they are beneficial, and how you think that other people may perceive them, that would be fantastic. As always as well, if you could comment, like, subscribe, that would be fantastic, but don't worry too much about it. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks. Bye.